But I'm an ocean baby. I love reporting around the ocean. I have done reporting broadly around climate change, but even in that, the ocean has been something that's been really close to me. Wait a minute, I just want to make sure I can see some of you. Hold on. So these are just slides to kind of give you an idea of what I have done and what I mean by performing your journalism when it comes to reporting on the ocean and marine conservation, and how do you weave that story into a bigger picture of oneness? How do you create that oneness with your reader, with your viewer, or with your listener? So this is something that this is a quote from Rachel Carson, and this is something that I keep going back to, and that has inspired me to take up this kind of reporting. And the reason behind this line really resonates with me is that it keeps my reporting very centered. We want to be able to create a series of stories or podcasts or even beautiful sculptures. But the central idea of all that has to be that you are one with the ocean. We are one ocean people. Often in reporting, sometimes the story comes across as top down, as maybe we intruding into a specific ecosystem to tell a story that does not belong to us, or we trying to save a particular ecosystem. And that is something that I personally try to change with my reporting. It is more about discovery, it is more about community collaboration and how we realize our roots, that is the ocean. So I'll start with a sensor-based project that I started off after Columbia. And these stories are in chronological order. So as I got into this interactive world of storytelling and how it proceeded so far. So this was after Columbia. We got a grant to do a year-long project called RecSource. And it was a collaboration between 3 Stanford journalists and 3 Columbia students at that time. And the idea was to do a project that engages the community and brings another form of storytelling when it comes to coral reefs, coral reef bleaching, and marine conservation. So what we developed was something that was very easy to use. All the recreational divers and hotspots across the world use underwater cameras to record their experiences. And we just use that hook to design our project. So the idea was that divers go underwater and use their GoPro Hero 5s to take images, and then they come up and send us those images. And then we use those images, and we've designed a machine learning algorithm that can then pull out the fluorescence data out of those coral reef images to tell you their health metric in real time. So if you can see here, the top images are the ones we actually got from our, the people who contributed to our project. And when we ran the machine learning algorithm, we picked out pixel data to map out the health metrics of different coral hotspots across the world. Now, people would say, like, what does this add to the, the coral reef story that we read in headlines or on podcasts? And what we wanted to do was kind of change the blanket narrative that we get, say, 3 years or 4 years down the line when we hear, say, the Great Barrier Reef is beyond recovery, or one part of the reef has completely bleached. With this approach, we want to be able to have a much more regular monitoring system across hotspots that are visited either by divers or by people from the environmental department, and how they can then restore that reef by saying, okay, if there's an XY point where there's a reef that's unhealthy, but on the same reef, there's another point where the coral is doing better because of the ocean current, then we can transplant the reef and make it, salvage the situation before the entire thing gets bleached. And so what we did for this project is we wanted to have a macro-micro approach. And we worked with scientists who have mapped out, the coral reefs for bigger data sets. And then we gave them the smaller data sets. So for example, if you look at a map, and you see you see a coral reef suffering, or you see a specific hotspot suffering, then you can zoom in and zoom in even further. And then on specific GPS locations, you can actually see which part of the reef is worth transplanting and which part is not. A little bit about the methodology of this project. And this project has been the most tech heavy so far that I've indulged in. And this basically, the idea of color corresponding to the health metric of the coral is not new. This is a health chart that another community project in Queensland uses, which is basically divers go in with this health chart and they look at the color of the coral and they come back and they tick mark saying, oh, it was B1 or B2. And then depending upon what they recorded on their charts, scientists then develop a database of how the corals are behaving. We wanted to automate this because, you know, the recording of the color changes with the visibility of the water. It has a lot of varying factors. So the recordings won't be accurate. So we automated this part of the algorithm, and all you needed to do was dive with your camera and come back with the images. And on the right, you see a participant actually doing that in Florida. He's using one of our cameras and just taking a picture of the reef, and then we got the images when he came back on land. The most fantastic part of the project has to be the community participation that we were able to engage with. There's a part of me as a reporter that believes in decentralizing the storytelling. We want to be able to involve the community that's on the front lines, or that's, visits the reef on a regular basis, to be able to tell their own stories. And this was a diving group in Florida. It's an all women's dive group. They reached out to us and said, we want to participate in your project. And all of these women dived, I think, 5 to 6 times in a matter of 4 weeks to get us readings. And they even went on a TV show and did their own storytelling about the data they collected. And the beauty of that entire project was that you will not know what to protect unless you witnessed it yourself. So we could have done a story about coral reef bleaching in Florida or in Japan, but these women, they got to see it themselves. They became part of the process, and hence their stories were much more effective for the local audience. So that's the key point that came out from that particular project, community participation and collaboration, which is something that I try to keep central to most of my projects. This is the other project, and this was a very simple database project that I did as an investigative reporter based out of Colombia. And this was the time that the Panama Papers came out, and everybody was celebrating how journalists around the world could collaborate for a greater good, or for telling stories that required more depth, but were broader in scope. So we partnered up with journalists from across the world. Wherever you see these dots on screens, we had a local journalist reporting. And what we did was we took out the IPCC data sets for tide gauge measurements over a specific duration. We cleaned those data sets up and we made them available to the public in a user interface, in a friendly user interface. So all you needed to do was choose your language and then choose your continent, click on the dot, and you would be able to download all the tide gauge measurements for that specific spot. So the idea was that, say, a local reporter in Okinawa, Japan could go do their own story. And somebody sitting in New Delhi, India, or say Calcutta, India, could go do their own story. So this is again an example of where we do not take control of the big story as such, but we break it down into little chunks for everybody to report on. This is the story that I ended up doing as part of that project. So we didn't want to match data with the story on the ground, just because people often get lost in data. It becomes a very overwhelming story or something that's very abstract, but we wanted to match it with an anecdote on the ground. And I traveled to Japan for this story. And this is a small island called Kumejima, where they have this coral laboratory in Japan. And I think it's one of the most fascinating stories that I've had the fortune to do. And it's because Japan is trying to grow an island. There's this laboratory, you take a flight into Okinawa, which is like southern Japan, and then you take this tiny ferry off to this island where the only two things are this coral laboratory and a seaweed plant. So I definitely didn't fit in. I was like, what's going on? But this small laboratory is basically breeding baby corals and then transplanting them on to an island. And by an island, I'll show you what I mean. This is not an island. It's Okino Torishima, which is basically, it's called the Little Bird's View. It's a piece of land that Japan wants to claim as an island, just so that it can get access to the waters surrounding it and access to the Philippine Sea for geopolitical reasons. Of course, China debates the idea that this is an island because they're just generally just two protrusions, which if sea level rises, you can't see them. When the tide is high, you really can't see them. So what Japan is trying to do is actually grow coral underneath where you see the boundary. And so over the period of years, the coral on top would disintegrate to form sand, and it would form an island. And Japan would be able to claim this as an island and claim the waters around it. And now this is a long game, and the problem that they're facing is that sea levels are rising. So as and when they're trying to transplant the coral from beneath, the sea level is rising. So it's becoming harder for them to achieve that equilibrium where they can expect this island to form in, say, the next 100 years or so. But the good part about this project is that if this technology does work, if this works out, then it can really help atolls like Maldives and Fiji and all these coral atolls that are there around the world. But the only thing is we don't have 100 years to save them. So the Japanese are trying to do experiments to prove that this technology works. And if they do so, they're willing to share it with islands and atolls that will actually need it, require it sooner than later. These are the baby corals that they're growing in that lab. And this is a species called Acropora. They have different water conditions that they grow these corals, and then they go transplant. It's a very delicate operation because these baby corals don't take to the mother reef at times. And they've not had a very high success rate so far, but the Japanese are a hopeful bunch, and they're hoping that this island works. I hope to go back sometime and do a follow-up on the story and see how that process is working out. This is an example of a video form of storytelling. So I would take a moment to emphasize on the fact that as a storyteller, as a journalist, when you've come up with a story idea, it is equally important to decide what form it takes. Not every story merits to be a data story. Not every story merits to be a fancy VR piece. Some stories can be told very effectively using video or using print. So this was a documentary that I did right before coming to MIT as a Knight Fellow in 2019. And this was in the Maldives. I won't really call it work because it was 15 days on a dive boat. So it felt almost like a vacation. But the story was that we were trying to document manta ray conservation in the Maldives. If you don't know about the manta rays, these are these giant rays, and you probably have seen Moana when the grandmother turns into that ray. It's a beautiful ray, and I was in the water with them and I almost got slapped by one. They're huge. And so we went and did that story. What eventually turned out was a completely different piece. When we realized the person leading the expedition to save the species was Maisha Mohammed, a Maldivian girl. I was on that boat and I saw her, like whenever she would get ready to dive with a wetsuit on, everybody would just go still. All the men on the boat, the local men on the boat, couldn't digest the fact that she was the one diving and leading this expedition. And we were sharing a dorm, and I dove into it a little further, and I came to know that women or little girls and women in the Maldives don't know how to swim. They live on an island. They live on a low-lying island, which is going to have sea level rise, and the women don't know how to swim. It's for cultural reasons, for the fact that they've never been allowed to get into the water. It's generally been a male territory with the fishermen. and the tourism industry, but the women don't go inside the water. And so she stood out because she had a hijab on and a wetsuit on, and she was diving like the other expats on the boat and the film crew. So we decided to take a U-turn with the film. And of course, we do have manta rays in the documentary. It's currently in production. But we wanted to do a story about women on coastlines that do not know how to swim and what that means for their freedom and what does that mean for an island's preservation in the future. And we had 15 days of that shoot, but on the 10th day, I asked the captain and I said, can we go to a school? I would love to visit a school and talk to the kids there and to see what do they think of the ocean. And we kind of steered on. We had contacts at a school, at a local school. And the kids, some were fascinated, but the girls were mostly scared. They didn't want to get into the water. But the ones that were willing or keen enough, we got them on the boat and kind of just, pair them up with the divers that, the dive crew that we already had into the shallow end of the water. What you see in this image, like, are children who for the first time are experiencing the ocean. And I cannot express in words what the sounds they were emanating. It was amazing. But this is probably the most glamorous shot. We had a lot of crying, a lot of puking, a lot of seasickness. And what really changed, or what really changed the mood on the boat, were these two teachers that you see in the forefront of this image. They're wearing their traditional garb and they must be in their mid-30s. And these two teachers, and I was just watching them and I asked them, like, have you ever tried a snorkel? Have you ever, gone swimming? And they said, no, we are women, we don't do that. And I said, would you want to try? They agreed, and they didn't need much, we didn't have to really request them or convince them to swim. They jumped off the boat holding hands, and you can see that they're holding hands even in the picture. And looking at them, more children were willing to experience the sea. This was a very special moment for me as a reporter. And later on, when we did the filming, we did the documentary, we reached out to the Maldivian government, and we found out that they have in certain schools introduced a snorkeling program after the 2004 tsunami that happened, because they realized that even if the tsunami doesn't directly impact them in terms of like the 30-meter waves, there was a lot of flooding that happened in the Maldives. And women and children were at a higher risk of drowning because they just did not know what to do in case of an emergency. And so now in some schools, it has become mandatory for the children to be taken snorkeling at least once in their school life. So after that, whether they take to the ocean or not, it's completely up to them. But there are snorkeling expeditions where children get to go see the reef in the shallow area, come back, and at least, but with that, they're hoping that they induce some curiosity in these children. And that is how we would have the next generation of conservationists in these islands. We want these kids to be able to tell their own stories. And it's the simple philosophy of you would not know what to protect unless you know it well, or how to protect it unless you know it well. And that is the idea we wanted to pursue with this documentary. This, I wanted to share this print piece. I come from like my first foray into journalism was print, long form. And I've done a couple of these stories, coastal stories, these ocean stories, but this one was my last big one. I wanted to share it for a couple of reasons. When we think of telling ocean stories as journalists, there are many ways we can go about it. We can focus on ocean technology, we can focus on marine conservation, and the next string of stories that we really can focus on is community health and the coastal communities that are living next to the ocean. And the idea for this story came to me I think 2 years back in Sri Lanka. And I was on this beach and everything was beautiful. It was a beautiful sunset, but there was this really eerie feeling that I was getting. It just didn't feel right to me. And I had a kind of a paralysis. I just couldn't go into the water. And because right where we were standing, right like 2 roads across, there was a small tsunami museum. and it was a shack. It was not a big building. And we went inside, and there were just images and images of drowned railway coaches and clocks that had stopped at 9 o'clock. They were stored in a row. And that image haunted me so much. I just couldn't get it out of my head. So my entire, the team that I was, with in Sri Lanka, they were having a great time, but I just couldn't fathom the fact that, 15 years ago, something terrible had happened on this beach or right across it. And, how do you move on with life, and what happens to the people who are affected by it? So I wrote to my editor and I said, it's going to be 15 years since the tsunami, and I want to do a story. I want to be able to do a story about the Indian Ocean tsunami. And, we figured out how to go about it, and I was sent to Aceh, which is ground zero of the Indian Ocean tsunami that happened. So Aceh was like flatlined. They had more than 200,000 deaths. There wasn't much remaining of that city. And when we went I went with a photographer, and we went in the month of Ramadan. And this park that you see, I was just standing right across the street, and the siren for the mosque went off, which is the evening prayer after which they break their fasts, and everybody, goes to pray. And it was such a special moment because this tree was blooming. They had the holy prayer going, and then I turned around and I saw this is actually a mass grave where 12,464 people are buried. So it was a very it was a stark moment for me to realize that the grass that I'm standing on was like a mass grave at some point, and what it would have looked like then, and what remnants of that disaster still stays with these people. So this is what actually Aceh looked like after the tsunami. It was completely devastated, and once the tsunami happened and everything just kind of crumbled to the ground, the foreign aid came in. We had Red Cross coming in. We had the United Nations coming in. There was a lot of money that was poured in for the Indian Ocean tsunami. It was one of the biggest fundraisers that was ever done for a natural disaster in modern time. And at that time, Aceh was having, the tsunami put a stop to a civil conflict that Aceh had been going through for 30 years, because of which Aceh was a violent place to begin with. And the condition that the foreign aid organizations kept was that you need to make peace before we come in. And so the Indonesian government figured out a peace treaty, and these guerrilla fighters were incorporated into mainstream society in a very rushed manner to bring the aid in, which is focused on a 5-year period of recovery. But that created a lot of issues because you cannot expect a society to recover within a 5-year period. We're not only talking about infrastructure, we're talking about cultural cracks, we're talking about psychological impacts, we're talking about livelihoods, fishery. And so people did not plan that on a larger scale. The organizations just wanted to come in, build something and leave. And that was the story that I chased. This is a small village in Lak Kruet in Aceh. And by the looks of it, it's really pretty. It's like a cookie cutter village. It's on a hilltop right by the ocean side. So it's it's like at an elevated level. So they are not at a risk of tsunami. But this entire village cluster is empty. It's abandoned. Apart from 2 or 3 houses in this village cluster, nobody's staying here. And so much of the money has gone to waste. And I tried to figure out why these houses were built without really understanding the requirements of the people. And what happened in this case was that the community, the families that were rehabilitated here were fishermen. And so their livelihood is by the sea. They cannot live on a mountaintop and go down and fish every day and come back again. And the other aspect of it was running water. There was no running water here. The Canadian NGO that organized this entire village cluster did not plan for running water. So because of this ill-planned recovery, which was bound to happen because so much money came in such a short time period, we had cases like these empty villages. We had cases where there were abandoned schools, poorly made houses. So that was the story that I was trying to tell. how do we learn from a disaster recovery plan and how do we make it better? And fortunately, from the lessons that we've learned from the 2004 tsunamis recovery, we've implemented changes for the Typhoon Haiyan recovery that happened in 2013. So now policymakers are trying to build recovery plans that are longer term, 10 years, 15 years, just so that they do not repeat the same mistakes that they did in Aceh. There was a technical element to the story because we wanted to talk about how do we bring in disaster management to places like Aceh that are really vulnerable to earthquakes and tsunamis. And this is a tsunami shelter that the Japanese built, and it has like several floors, and the ground floor is built in a way that you can let the water through, and you climb up to the second and third floor, and that's where it's safe for you to reach out to in case of a tsunami. But the issue is that the infrastructure is there, but there is no disaster awareness. So people do not understand the concept of a vertical evacuation. They still try running inland, which is not fast enough in case you have a big tsunami like you had it in 2004. This is a really interesting project, which I had to leave in my prototype phase because of the current pandemic. But when I came to MIT, I came with a vision of expanding my skill set. How do you tell stories in forms that are different from audio, video, data, print? Because that's something that I had dabbled in a little bit. And so I decided installation art, sculpture, how does that work? And this is one piece that I created a few days before the university shut down. We were trying to figure out how do you create a sculpture around the ocean. And by hit and trial, this sculpture came around, and I never thought about referencing this Japanese wave painting and how the Japanese have illustrated waves in their scriptures, in their stories, but it just turned out that way. The beauty of art, you kind of do something and something else comes up. But the idea was to scale it up and then change the fabric to use fabric that's made out of recycled ocean plastic to just tell a better story. And on a scaled model, if you scale this up, it would look like a beautiful sculpture. And I'm hoping that when the time is right, I can work on scaling this up for an exhibit. Now, this is the most interesting part of the presentation, something that I wanted to spend more time on. And these are projects that I have in the pipeline. Some of them will need a little bit of reinvention, a little bit of thinking as to how we function in the current scenarios. But I would love to know what you think about these and how we could make them work. So the one of the projects that's coming up soon at the end of May is a data sonification project that's part of my fellowship at the Knight Fellowship at MIT. And the idea is focusing on schools that collapse as a result of big earthquakes and tsunamis. And how do we bring to light the impact on vulnerable populations, people who cannot make their own choices of how to evacuate or what to do in the times of a disaster. And I went through a lot of cases. Again, it started off with the Japanese tsunami and the story of the Okawa Elementary School, where the entire school went underneath the wave, which was very surprising for Japan, because Japan is one of the most prepared countries in the world. So people couldn't figure out what went wrong. They had disaster manuals, but the teachers did not follow it. There was some kind of miscommunication, and as a result, the students died. And so I wanted to do this data sonification project installation where I collected school data back from, say the 1930s, the earliest data of school collapses, and sonify it and make it into a musical composition. The bigger scale, at the bigger scale, it would be a musical composition with a composer, a Japanese composer that I was working with. And we planned to showcase the piece using the Boston Symphony Orchestra in 2021, 2022. Thank you, Jenny, for putting me in touch with them. But we're still working on the logistics of things. And of course, data sonification simply means that you convert data into sound somehow. So here the data is not really statistics. What I am using are images of these school collapses that have happened, and I'm converting their pixel data into sound, into waveform, and then using that as the base of the musical composition to build upon. And we have different layers of songs and sounds that we are meshing into to form the beautiful orchestral piece if everything works out. But I want to share with you one part of the musical piece that we will be using at the very tail end, and it is a sound of hope, the musical composition of hope at the very tail end. It is a song, an elementary song, school song that Japan uses to test its disaster management systems, sound systems at 4 p.m. in schools across, like in small clusters in Tokyo. And we will use this sound, this basic musical sound, and work with the pitch and to match the magnitude of earthquakes and to match the magnitude of data in the final piece. Let me just play a little bit for you. Yeah, so this is just to give you an idea of what we wanted to end the musical piece with. And this is a really big project. I'm trying to I'm trying to put finishing touches on the prototype by mid-May. But the idea would be to make it into a bigger, a much more compelling story through the voices of the children. So the children's choir the Boston Children's Choir would then sing on top of the baseline musical composition that we make out of the data set. This is another project that I'm really interested with, and I must credit the Open Oceans group. They were the ones who put that idea in my head through all the talks that we were having about how do you mesh scientific know-how with indigenous knowledge, and how do you bring the two worlds together, because they belong together. They don't really belong apart. How do you mix research with intuition, and how does that work? So I did a lot of research. I was really curious to document indigenous knowledge around the ocean, because what we right now see in the news or see people covering is generally indigenous communities on land, or like in the Arctic or in the Amazon. But we really haven't focused a lot around the Pacific Ocean or the Indian Ocean. So I really wanted to see what songs do we have, what poems do we have, what traditions do we have around the ocean, and how do the indigenous communities used to voyage, how did they voyage in the past, how did they take care of their ocean as a natural resource. And this is one of the stories I want to do as part of my documenting project. And these are stick charts that were used by the people at Marshall Islands. And basically it's just made out of sticks and shells. And they use these stick charts to map ocean swells. So there are 3 to 4 types of swells that they map onto these stick charts. And the small shells basically are points for atolls and islands. And I did talk about this with Jenny, and what I want to do is, because it's a dying art, people do not make these stick charts anymore. The young generation from Marshall Islands do not know how to read or make these charts. So what I would hopefully be able to do one day is work with somebody who knows, like the last ancestors who have this knowledge, and be able to recreate an already existing stick chart for today's times. So what would this stick chart look today? For the same location, same islands, how would that change? How would that have changed over the years? And what significance does this knowledge hold today? I must tell you that these are not maps in the sense that people they didn't carry these on their canoes when they voyaged. They memorized it before they actually went on with their voyages. So this was really personal to the person who built the chart, because every stick chart has a very different aesthetic, a very different design to it. So I'm curious to document the entire process of how people used to build these stick charts up and what their significance is today. And that would lend to a bigger story, something that I hope to travel and document across islands over the period of a few years. And then maybe even reach out to researchers and showcase the research that we have to create a collaboration of how they can best work with indigenous communities for ocean conservation. This idea came once we discussed with Nenua, as part of one of our open ocean discussions, as to who will be able to tell the island story 20 years from now. And what does a scientist look like? Can an indigenous community member be a scientist 20 years from now? Can we empower them with the tools, the technical tools, but at the same time, make sure that indigenous knowledge is also transferred from one generation to the other? Because clearly the indigenous members and the indigenous community members are also a dying species. We need to be able to document the old traditional knowledge that they had. How did they voyage oceans without any technical abilities, just by looking at the stars or by ocean swells? And that really fascinates me, the transference of this knowledge and the small role that I could possibly play in it by documenting these traditions and these rituals that they have. And I must say, for this previous slide, I did write this down. This was something that Nanoa from the Pacific Voyaging Society said during one of our discussions. And he said that today, like, voyaging inherently in their old tradition for these indigenous communities were all about discovering islands. But today, voyaging is about saving the only island we have. And that with that new notion in mind, how do you change the concept of voyaging? How do you change the concept of navigation? In a sense, we're all navigators if we are working to make a better world. With that idea, I want to infuse scientific knowledge with indigenous cultures and traditions. Sorry. I talk a lot. So this, I'm going to wrap it up really quickly. This is another project that I'm looking at doing. And this is more based on ocean technology. And the idea came from a visit to Woods Hole and Marine Biological Laboratory last year. And I realized that scallops have a very different way. They have a very complex mechanism by which they see underwater. And I was talking to a scientist who was working on, complex vision, and we were brainstorming ideas of how do we make a virtual experience by which a viewer can experience how a scallop sees the ocean, because there are different mirrors that kind of form images differently, and then make a composite image for the scallop to see what it sees in its surrounding. And we want to be able to recreate that in a virtual experience. So to that effect, if everything goes well, I've been invited to do a fellowship at the Marine Biological Laboratory next year. And I'm hoping to, flesh this idea out more to figure out how we can design a virtual experience, but so that people understand complex vision underwater and how does that translate into storytelling. And this is the last project that I want to talk about, and this is more of an idea than a project right now, and it's very close to my heart, because if I could sum up my entire MIT experience in a year's, like in an year span, it would be this. And it is something that I want to develop as a design experiment or a small lab where designers, scientists, storytellers work together in site-based locations to tell stories over a period of time. And what I want to do is create capsule locations where we have sensors, we have designers, we have people monitoring those areas, those specific ecosystems for over 20 years. And the stories that come out not only reflect the change in the ecosystem, but also in the change in the people living in that ecosystem and change in the people reporting it. And the whole idea for that project comes from the basic notion that erosion is a part of life. You know, the sand that you see on the beach was once a glacial deposit or a mountain. And the fact that if you broaden your scale of reporting, you broaden your vision a little bit and not see stories from a very short-term point of view, you will be able to appreciate the beauty of the earth. You will be able to appreciate the beauty of natural processes and even report more objectively about the disruptions that we are facing. And I'm currently in talks with a couple of collaborators to work on a pilot location in India where we can monitor, put sensors, get data from those sensors on a real-time basis, and then bring in artists and engineers and biologists to study that site for 10 to 15 years, 20 years, and create stories around it. But this is clearly in the very initial phases, and the baseline idea is to bring all thinking heads together and to create this beautiful, braid of ideas around the ocean into one thing that I can term as the school of sand. So with that, I come to the end of my presentation, and if there are any questions, I would love to take them.